Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Padres EVT Podcast in Focus. We are back once again. It's every week. There's a new episode, and we are back. I'm your co-host, Diego Garcia, alongside me, my fellow co-host, Willy Warren. Glad to have you back on the show, and it's been an eventful week in the world of Padres coverage from the last time we spoke about rotation battles and just roster battles, and now we have some more answers.
Yeah, no, that's we talked about a lot last week. Who's going to compete where, who could compete here, and like there's absolute there. Now they've just added an absolute ton of madness to those spots. They've really nailed down starting pitching. They've added a couple of first base candidates. If by the way you view one certain player, and yeah, so there's been an absolute ton, and we have a ton of players to get into today and talk about, starting with, I think, the absolute biggest one, the big fish, Nick Castellanos, who will be earning $20 million, maybe $21 million in 2026, with the Phillies paying $20 million of that, as the Padres will only be paying the minimum, as they picked him up on that 1-year minimum deal. I want to get your initial thoughts on Nick Castellanos and what he brings to the table, how where you value him as a 36-year-old DH right field / first base competitor.
I like the addition. I think that they're looking to bring in someone who has playoff experience, someone who has been a leader in the locker room, someone who has been who they know has potential to be a successful contributor, even in a part-time role. I read about the potential of bringing in Castellanos a couple months back when there was all the reporting that he was on his way out of Philadelphia, especially when they signed Adolis Garcia. But the most interesting part with Castellanos is just how he has conducted himself in his less than a week as a member of the Padres organization. He's shown, he really values that, guys like Craig Stammen, Steven Souza, members of this coaching staff have played in the big leagues, know of the struggles and the tribulations of being in the big leagues, and which was clearly some part of the disconnect in Philadelphia with him. So I'm not expecting MVP candidate 2021 flexing on a pitcher Castellanos, but if we can get 2024 Castellanos, even which was still fairly productive offensively, I just hope he can make the most of the opportunities that he has to play. That's really all I'm looking forward to with him. He's already he's making good contact in spring training. If you saw they're posting, live ABs, he's doing pretty well there. And then how will he handle first base? Because, first base is easy. No, it's incredibly hard, to quote Moneyball there for a moment. But we've both kind of talked about Castellanos. I want to get your thoughts on what was your initial reaction to hearing, oh, they signed Nick Castellanos?
Yeah, it was definitely a shock. It's not a player that you definitely you felt like was covered much as a free agent, because he technically wasn't for most of the off season. Although there was that talk that he would be parting ways. Definitely, the issues he had in Philadelphia they're definitely a bit concerning. But what I've seen in this week, you kind of touched on it a bit, that he has conducted himself really, really well. He's happy to be playing for players with MLB experience, and that was the number one thing that made me feel good about it going in. I brought up a couple weeks on I think last weekend on my page that he is declining. Just over the past 3 seasons, when bat speed has been tracked, he's fallen from 72.4 miles an hour to 70.5, as well as dropping and slugging every year. So there's no question you're not going to get that 576 slugging percentage flexing on pitch. You're not going to get that in any probably nearly the same capacity. But I do think playing in San Diego on a new change of scenery will, bode well for him. it's obviously kind of foolish to guess that a change of scenery is going to, predict a player, because that's all intuition basically. But I do think there's, just the early signs we've seen, like this is going to work out for both sides, I think.
Yeah, it really gave this feeling of like, Castellanos knew what he was looking for once Philadelphia wasn't an option, and San Diego knew they wanted a veteran bat. So, like, simply put, it was, as you said, it was the right sort of fit. And then you mentioned his bat speed has been really kind of diminishing over, since bat speed has been tracked. It's been by a couple ticks, nothing too significant. But last year, one thing I wanted to point out is, his sweet spot in terms of launch angle. So launch angle, sweet spot, I know you know all about this, but to our listeners who, some of us are still learning a lot about these baseball analytics, launch angle sweet spot, I believe, is between 15 and 25 degrees. If I'm not mistaken. He ranked in the 88th percentile, as 39% of all his batted balls were in that sweet spot, which was one of the best figures in the league. Again, 88th percentile. So when he makes contact with authority, it's usually hit pretty well. It's just he wasn't doing a lot of that last year. So as a result, the numbers were down. But still a 400 slugging. He's had between a 400 and a 500 slugging over the past 4 seasons. So it's going to be interesting. My one concern about, going from Philadelphia to San Diego is Philadelphia is kind of a bandbox. It's one of the most hitter-friendly parks in the league. San Diego is more of a hitter-neutral, pitcher-friendly sort of park, especially early in the season, because we all know when that marine layer kicks in, it's fly balls that you think are absolutely crushed or dying at the warning track. I think with Castellanos coming to San Diego, I'm hoping to see that he can hit it into the gaps at the very least, because when he's hitting doubles, when he's getting extra base hits, he is a legitimate threat at the plate. And if we can see that, like, let's say he gets 400 at bats, hits about 12 to 15 homers, but has 25 to 30 doubles, like that adds up, because most of the time he's going to be hitting the middle to the back end of the lineup, so he'll have runners on. And I think he's got a great he's in a great position here to have guys who are consistent on-base machines, on-base threats, to be hitting ahead of him in the lineup. So it's really hard to ask for a better situation if you're Nick Castellanos. Like, it's a good fit, just simply put. And there's obviously the Manny Machado connection. He and Manny Machado played ball growing up, and he's known Manny forever. So, there's a lot of talk about Manny bringing in his guys, but when he knows like who he kind of recommends to the front office or anything, it's because he knows these guys can play. And so now we just got to see how Castellanos does in spring. I think that's going to be something to watch.
Yeah, no, it's great that you brought up his launch angle sweet spot, because that, like on his underlying page of stats on Baseball Savant, that is, objectively the only, spot where he ranks above the major league average, and he ranks well above that major league average, as you said, the 88th percentile there. And it's definitely
it's right there.
Yeah, it's definitely unconventional to, to say that a hitter's best strength is the angle that he swings at. That's something that probably wouldn't hear very long ago, long ago. That's not something that, is definitely a newer term. But I do think that whole, change in, home ballpark, that'll definitely take away some of his value. And, the marine layer, I mean, that'll be a factor for him. And, that might limit how effective he is at hitting fly balls, because it is a huge uppercut swing. Like he's trying to get everything up, everything mostly to the pull side at this point in his career. And yeah, so like we'll definitely have to see how well that can translate to, gaps, doubles. I mean, it is important to remember that, looking back at the 2025 season, the Padres will take any slug they can get, like in any form. That's the math, like that is the mathematical solution to their, like that is X. That is what was missing from their team last season. And so I do think, even just, like, yeah, like 20, 25 doubles, just anywhere in that range would just absolutely be huge, especially with the on base options that he has in front of him that should be really, really effective at, giving him some runners to drive in.
Most definitely. And speaking of, kind of things that could help or hurt players' performance, the Padres brought in a literal handful's worth of pitchers into spring training to compete for, the back end of the rotation or even just minor league depth. They brought in Griffin Canning, they brought in Herman Marquez, and then most recently Walker Buehler on a minor league deal. Now Marquez and Canning are making just, I believe, 1.75 million to around 2 million. Like, it's not a ton of money, which, to be quite honest, I was very much surprised when they signed Marquez this past Saturday when that news dropped, because like, we knew Marquez was having a slow market. He hasn't been particularly great since 2021. I was just surprised that he signed for that little. Right, having written about him in December, I thought he was going to get around 4 million on a prove it deal, considering what the market was asking for. But to get him for under $2 million was, I think, an absolute steal for a guy who, even on its worst day, can give you 6 innings.
Yeah, no, the market for starting pitchers definitely kind of slowed down as spring started. I feel like, at the very beginning we saw Cease go for a ton, and then, Ranger Suarez, you had, your Framber Valdez that was a little more recent, which is, kind of like de-escalated that a little bit. And then, now, I can totally see why, like if like 4 million would have made sense at the beginning of the off season, but just seeing where he is now, he was just, there's he's no other way to put it. He was one of the worst qualified pitchers in 2025. Struggled to get both whiffs and limit hard contact, which is not really, that's not a combination that allows most pitchers to be had to have really any success at all. So I do think it's good that the Padres are like, like you said, they're able to get this type of pitching depth on the money that they got it for. I do think it's great to play like a watch them and find out type of deal. I think that's really smart. But I'll really be intrigued to see what pitches he throws, if he makes any changes, because there was not a lot working with for him in 2025.
Oh, definitely. That's kind of what made his market stagnate for so long, because he was coming off Tommy John surgery, I believe, in 2023 going to 2024. Last year is his first full year removed from the procedure, and quite frankly, he was, like you said, one of the worst qualified pitchers in all of baseball. If we really want to see just how rough it was, you're talking about first percentile run value overall, first percentile fastball run value, and the thing is, the arsenal isn't particularly terrible. Like, there's some stuff that you can work with here. I think the biggest thing with Marquez, when we look at his performance, it's all up here or it's here in the middle. There's nothing here. Like, this slot that he throws from and the vertical approach angle he comes from is perfect sort of sweeper gyro slider territory, but he doesn't have that at the moment. That's one of the things that he and the Padres could definitely work on, simply because where he's coming from and that curveball is really good at sea level. When it's not at sea level, well, Colorado and Coors Field happens. But with him, and then Griffin Canning, who was pretty good for the Mets before he went down to an Achilles injury, like, I think they now have some more, what's the word I'm looking for here? I think it's starting options that make you feel a little more comfortable going into the season, because we've talked about JP Sears, and Matt Waldron, Jackson Wolf, and guys like that. But to have guys who have done it at the major league level before is like, as a fan or as someone who analyzes what they do, gives you a little bit more. It's a bit of a safety net, I guess you can call it.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. It's not like any one pitcher like stands out as that guy who you're like, oh, he like you would think he's got that fifth starter role locked up. But I mean, I do think objectively, if you had say 4 JP Sears and they all had a different background and track record and all that, and like they all had a different chance to improve, a different way that they could be better than they were in the past, I think that should make you feel better as a fan of any team. And I think that's exactly what the Padres just did. It's like essentially is they're bringing in different stories, like you said, Herman Marquez is coming off, he just played his first season back from Tommy John, someone we'll get to a little bit later. Walker Buehler coming off 2 Tommy John, like that. Like there's a ton of stuff that these guys have went through and are even going through, as Griffin Canning slated to miss the first part of the season. I think it's just this, it's just a, look, see, find out kind of who is where, who had a good off season, who had the best off season. And then spring, is not just going to be that little, tune up and like, we know who we're, going with. Like, no, they don't know who they're going with. And that's what's really exciting about it is, when we're watching these games and, everybody's in and out and in and out, like when they come in, like that is prime time, lock in. This is the stuff that really, really counts. And, I'm really excited to see, Stammen seems to just be preaching, competition on competition when it comes to these spots. And so I'd love to see, how early they pitch, how often they pitch. I'm really excited to see. And especially with Herman Marquez, who, like you said, has a ton of interesting pitch shapes. I'll say, at least in there, a little intriguing. His 85-mile-an-hour hammer curveball is going to be super fun to see what they do with that. But yeah, that's based. I mean, I'm just really, really, really excited to see what they do with using those guys and how they perform.
Oh, most definitely. That's part of, like you mentioned, Stammen's been preaching competition. And I think healthy competition can be good. It really helps bring out some of the best in some of these guys who they are. They're all professionals. They know, like, okay, I'm not just here to cash in. I have a legitimate opportunity and I want to make the best case, the best impression that I can, for my career and to help this team win. And from what we've heard from, we've already heard from Canning and Buehler from the media, and these guys are pretty motivated. They want to make the team. Buehler, for example, he got to speak with 97.3 The Fan, and he said, he sees himself as a starter, wants to make the rotation out of camp, and he's very determined. I think, when it comes to projecting a fifth starter, it doesn't necessarily have to be someone because so far King, Pivetta, and Musgrove are all right-handed. It's not going to be guaranteed that, the fifth starter is going to be a lefty because they've run the all-righty rotation before and it's been successful. Like just in the middle of last year when you had Ryan Bergert in there as the 5, he was pretty successful along with Randy Vasquez and Nick Pivetta, who was pretty much anchoring that staff. So it's really going to be this is when spring training really gets fun because there's these storylines and you're like, oh, how did this guy do? Let me go look at, the numbers behind it, because thankfully, and I'm for all of us stat heads out there, thank goodness that, they finally put StatCast in all the spring training parks as of last year. I believe the last few kind of got done fairly recently. They finally did it. So we can, finally have our sit down after the game and look through all of the numbers and say, okay, this guy did this guy did that. And it's just, have the zillion tabs of stats open, but even so, just enjoy taking it all in. For lack of a better term, we are so back in terms of like baseball is about to get started, and it's a really exciting time just to see this particular Padres team in their spring training competition. But today on February 18th, if you had to guess, if you had to tell me, who do you think rounds out the rotation? Who do you think is the five to open the year? Who do you think makes it, and why?
I believe, and still, I've kind of been on his train since we started doing this. But I do think, at least to start the year, I would definitely look into it. Some other options as to who finishes the year, but JP Sears, I think he starts the year as the fifth starter, just because he pitched towards the end of the season with the Padres, which I think gives him the biggest leg up among a ton of different really intriguing cases. And he did pitch well in his time, his starts at Petco Park. And I don't see, that's not exactly true. I can see someone coming out of nowhere and having an excellent spring. And there's a lot of, I think the key theme with all of the new guys we're seeing is all of them could just, pitch on this new level that would, kind of be like, oh, well, that kind of makes sense. That's what a team would sign him to do. And that rounds out the fifth starter. I mean, you can keep in mind, this isn't the third starter role, the second starter role. This is the fifth starter. This is the last guy, like the back end of the, really anything that comes out to average or slightly below it, that's kind of going to be enough. And so I think that I do think Sears has the quote unquote inside track, but I would definitely watch early on to see, is Marquez getting more swings and misses? Is Buehler able to spin the ball better than he was the past season? Is Matt Waldron is how's his knuckleball doing versus there's so much to watch, and that's gonna be really, really exciting. But if I had to pick one on the 18th, I would argue JP Sears is the most likely candidate to get it. And I would be really, really intrigued to see if you have the same thoughts, or if you think that one of the newcomers or one of the younger guys can potentially take that role.
It's tough because there's a ton of options. There's obviously, we named Marquez, Buehler, Waldron, Canning, Sears, Marco Gonzalez is in spring training. Who knows what we're going to get out of him? I think right now, given the way the roster shapes out, I think I would have to say Marquez would probably be the five, because he's on a guaranteed contract. And, I don't want to lean in the direction of, just because he's guaranteed money means he's going to make the roster, because we've seen it happen where, a guy gets a guarantee, doesn't play well, and he gets cut a month into the season. Or even recently, the Dodgers had Andy Ibanez, and then they DFA'd him, even though he wasn't a guaranteed contract. So I think with Marquez, if he can show that the curveball still has that bite and that he can get swings and misses, he's definitely got a shot at it. I'm really interested to see what Walker Buehler can do. Because when do the Padres first play the Dodgers? I'm curious now, because now I'm not really a believer in the whole narrative ball aspect of things, because sometimes it feels ridiculous to even really just talk about narratives in the game of baseball. But I would love it, just as a fan of the game, if they have Walker Buehler start a game against LA, even though that's not until the middle of May. That would just be cinema, I think. It's because we've seen there's guys who go from one side of the rivalry to another. We saw it with Tanner Scott. We've seen it with Blake Snell now. I almost forgot about him. it'd be so interesting just to see the reactions to that, because we didn't really see that when he signed. I would love to for entertainment purposes, because at the end of the day, sports is also entertainment for the viewer. But realistically, I think the 5 ends up being Marquez, and I think, but here's the one thing, because I really liked your point about Sears, I will say this. Would you rather see Sears or Kyle Hart in a long relief role?
Just because of how Hart like changed his stuff up a little bit. He added some, clear velocity to his fastball. He added some, break to his sweeper. I would say I like Hart out of the pen more, just because he kind of fits the bill a little bit better with that big breaking ball. And Sears has his own sweeper, but it's not on the same caliber of Hart. And I do think that Sears, I think Sears' biggest strength is his ability to go deep into games. And I don't think that's necessarily something that's cut out for him in the pen. So I would prefer to see Hart there for sure. But a really interesting way to look at because as you said, you believe Herman Marquez has the probably the biggest chance to make their fifth starter role because he has that guaranteed money. And Fangraphs also takes your side with this. They also have Marquez as their current fifth starter for the Padres. I think it's interesting, and it's a very long shot, kind of unrealistic, maybe sort of view on it. But Marquez is somebody who I feel like could fit the bill as a long reliever if they kind of see if they kind of see in camp that they don't have the fifth starter that they thought they had when they gave him that guaranteed money. I do think that with that super power curveball, and he has thrown high. I think he's touched the high 90s. At some point, and at some point, and he's sitting more 94, 95 now. But I do think that's something that they could consider with him, with just the way he could play that super, like he could possibly add a little bit of fastball velocity, and he could play a kind of power fastball, power curve. I do think that's a possibility if they were to give that fifth role to a Sears or a Buehler, which I think also would be probably the most fun. I think nobody. I mean, unless there's just people who cannot stand former Dodgers, they buy into that. They can't do it at all. I think Buehler. I mean, I think like that all aside, he would be the most fun to give a chance to, and just to give him a couple starts. It might be funnier than frustrating if he doesn't do well in his first couple starts. But I do think that narrative thing, I would also love to see him pitch against the Dodgers, just because of the type of competitor that he is, and how like kind of how he came in. He didn't have anything against the team or the organization. Like, it was a very fresh start vibe, when he was talking to 97.3 The Fan. And I think I would love to see him, and I have a good feeling he would be really, really amped up against a team like the Dodgers. So I that's very narrative, kind of fantasy type stuff, but I do think, yeah, it's fun. And I don't think there's a single fan that would say, no, I need Marquez or Sears to start this game. I'm not okay with Walker Buehler starting. I think that I don't think there's many fans that wouldn't want to see that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because when you mentioned Marquez to the bullpen, I immediately thought of his teammate in Colorado, Antonio Senzatella, who I know he pitched against the Padres last year at Coors Field. There was one game, I think it was a 21-0 game, if I'm not mistaken,
Ooh.
where Senzatella comes into the game and he's pumping 98, 99. And I'm like, when the blank did this guy start throwing this hard? Because I remembered him as a starter and I never thought, I don't even remember him throwing 97. 90. I knew he was like a 94, 95 kind of guy. And I think if Marquez can kind of do that in a long relief role, because his hardest average fastball velo in his career, I believe, was 95.6 miles an hour on average. And that was back in 2022. So if the velo's back, having that, the curveball, and maybe even like the changeup or even just a sinker to play off of that, I think for Marquez, that would be great out of the bullpen because he's not the tallest guy, but he's got some mass on him, so he can really bring it in short stints. I think the more that we've talking about it, I think the more I'm starting to like Walker Buehler in that 5 spot because I don't know if a lot of Padres fans know this, but there's actually the Padres having former Dodgers on their pitching staff goes back to the very beginning of the franchise. Back in the expansion Padres, here's our weekly little bit of baseball history. The expansion Padres had a guy by the name of Johnny Padres on their pitching staff, left-handed pitcher. Longtime
I
Dodger,
get
spent a
this.
couple of years with the Tigers, but his final season was with the Padres. Do I know why they took him in the expansion draft? No, because like trust me, I've looked everywhere because it's a fun little tidbit of Padres history. But I know there's gonna be some people who are like, it's weird seeing Walker Buehler in the brown and gold, but if he can pitch well, because I really don't think he was a good fit in Boston. I really think a guy who makes most of his success by throwing the fastball up in the zone, going to a team that does not like the four seamer and just morally steers away from it because that's what it feels like unless your name's Garrett Crochet. Like it was just a bizarre fit for him in Boston. So I think the Padres will definitely be a team that helps him play to his strengths and like I'm really starting to like the idea. I think, is it like go out and buy the jersey crazy level of idea? No, because it's probably going to be a 1 year thing. If anything, he just parlays it into a bigger deal. But it's fun, and I can't remember the last time in spring training there was a story that was this much, for lack of a better word, it feels like chaos ball in the best possible way. And I can't remember the last time the Padres had a story like that. So I think it's fun. And would it be fun to see? I think, yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. Buehler going to the Red Sox was not a great fit at all for him. I think it was a great fit on picture day, maybe, and I think it was kind of cool seeing him go there and like leave it like that. That was cool, and then it kind of ended there, and definitely not the right staff for him and the park and all that. But because I do think that he'll play a ton better at Petco Park, favors the four seamer, the fly ball. I mean that's where you want to play if you're someone who loves to throw a four seam fastball. I do want to bring up going away from the Padres history to going back to nerding out on baseball and analytics and stuff.
Yeah.
I want to give a shout out to my guy Danny Barand on X, who
I
brought up
don't
a
know how
really
to say it.
I think it's Barand. I feel like that's his name, but he brought up a really really good point about after Walker Buehler's second Tommy John surgery, there was an objective drop off in his ability to spin the ball, like his just like down hundreds of RPMs, and that's something that really really sticks that's something that really really sticks out as someone coming back from a second Tommy John on the scouting report is that's huge. And Danny brought up a really, really good point that could be because of scar tissue that is impacting his ability to like rotate his external elbow, or like I probably said that maybe backwards and upside down,
No,
but
the point does come through though.
But yeah, his external elbow rotation isn't it isn't the same that it once was, and that could be holding back his ability to throw the curveball and the sweeper, because those are two pitches that require really, really high spin rates. You know, being able to kind of snap that elbow really, really hard, and that's like my biggest statistical like kind of thing where I'm not really sure how good he could be, like where I'm like, oh, like that's definitely going to hold him back to be from being, the pitcher that he once was. But I do think, he throws enough of his fastballs to still be effective as a fifth starter. So I do think, like it could work out, and he could definitely shock everybody by becoming a regular in the Padres rotation. I mean, how crazy would that be? Like, that's crazy to think about, that he could pitch every fifth day. But, for now, we'll really, really be paying attention closely to his spin rate in spring training, as we now have that data for every one of his starts. So that's one, that's one big thing that, I think that's the thing to watch for with Buehler in spring training.
Definitely, I know I'm not a licensed medical professional, so I can't jump to any conclusions on the stuff about the scar tissue or the, external rotation. What I can do, just going off, the numbers of what he was doing last year, he was mostly fastball, cutter, sinker, and then the slider and the curveball were the most used, really, breaking pitches. So I think it's a matter of disrupting timing for hitters, because he did throw 7 pitches last year. The sweeper, in a short sample size, looked really good. It had more 2.6 inches higher break than the average right-hander, coming in at about 80 miles an hour. So, is he going to be the same Walker Buehler that punched out 15 Padres in a complete game? No. But if, he can be an older, wiser version of that same Buehler who can rack up strikeouts and get quick outs through just a masterclass of sequencing, I think we're in a much better spot, and you'll definitely take that. And again, this is for your fifth starter, who probably won't pitch in a playoff game should the Padres make it there. Probably ends up being your long man unless he has like a career renaissance at age 31, which is wild. He's been around forever. So easy to forget he's barely 31. Like, I thought he was, based on his career, sounds like 34, 35, but he's only 31. So there's definitely a lot to look out for with him. And, that's not all the depth that they have. And, they did add some depth for the bench, bringing in Aztec for life, Ty France on a minor league deal, which is, again, another fun story. Just a local guy, went to San Diego State, and now here he is coming back to the organization that drafted him. So, what are your thoughts on Ty France coming back?
Definitely another kind of cool, feel good story type of thing, where it's like, that like whenever a player comes back to the team who drafted him, especially in the 34th round, that's, an awesome story in itself. But I do think that he does bring an element of defense that the Padres were missing there. And I think it's that, like, past all of the, he's back, him and Craig were teammates, like past all of that, he is a great defensive player. He was 96th percentile in outs above average, and with a group of Gavin Sheets, Miguel Andujar, and Nick Castellanos, possibly, that's not a very defensive minded group right there. And And I do think that, I mean, I can't really recall seeing a defensive replacement come in at first base ever. But if there ever was a team to do that, it might be the Padres, because I mean that, like, it's just a night and day gap in how good of a defender those, like Francis versus the rest of the bunch there, because like we've still yet to see Sung Mun Song play. He'll probably be back healthy just before the season, and so his ramp up will be intriguing. I believe he was a good defender in the KBO, which is obviously a little less competition, but I don't think defense is something that it is something that kind of translates better than say offense or slugging or whiff rate, like that stuff. So I do think it'll be interesting to see what he brings when he's back. But for now, France is the really only above average defender on that right side of the infield. I believe Jake Cronenworth is closer to average, and so it's just nice to have that there. Maybe he has been under a 700 OPS in the past 2 years, but I mean, it is nice to have that defensive floor there, and just know that like knowing that the player on the field is at least elite on defense is definitely something that I think the Padres will take at this state of their first base situation.
Definitely. I think you mentioned the last time we saw a defensive replacement at first base. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was 2023 when they would move Cronenworth over to first base. You'd have Kim play second, Bogart to short, and Manny at third. I jokingly used to call it the 4 shortstop infield, because these are all guys who former or current shortstops and all graded out fairly well defensively at short. I think with France, you're going to see a lot less Cronenworth at first base, which I think is I think that's good for Jake, because he grades out well up the middle. He played a really good shortstop when pressed into action there last season, which a lot of people forget about, because we're used to seeing him on the right side, but he handled shortstop a lot in 2021 and then a little bit last year when Bogey went down. I think it's a huge deal that they got a guy like Ty France, who won a Gold Glove, I believe, at the first base or utility spot, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong on that, but I think he has a Gold Glove in his on his mantle. And are we gonna get like prime Mariners Ty France levels of production? Probably not, because that was almost 5 years ago. But he's still been fairly serviceable as someone who hits left-handed batters, as somebody who can play some pretty reliable defense. He's had experience as a platoon bat, as a starting bat. So he's just an all-around team guy. And I think that's the right kind of guy that they wanted to bring in with the culture that they're building in this clubhouse and that they're trying to maintain and kind of have evolve going into not just this season, but the future. And one of the fun things about Ty France is, we'll talk a lot about his defense, about his acumen there, but kid can hit. Like, he was hitting almost 400 before he got called up at AAA. We talked all this stuff about Campy and how he did at AAA. Ty France hit almost 400 to open a year at AAA before getting called up. So, who will get the statue in El Paso? It's probably Campy, but we can't turn down. Even though that was 6 years ago for Ty, he still showed that he can play at the big league level last year. He's seen the World Series, and anytime you can add a bat with playoff experience and even better familiarity with the organization, I think it's a win, not just on picture day or on like in the media. It's a win for the clubhouse, because he's played with a lot of these guys.
Yeah, and it's not, it's a really great point that you brought up, that he can hit, like the underlying stuff does like him, like he 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 hasn't hit over 700 OPS in like the last 2 years. Sure, that sounds like more of a bench player when you're bringing him in on a 1-year deal after camps are already started. But he's his swing and miss, his chase rate, his strikeout rate, like that's all stuff that is favorable for him and is above average, at least his whiff and his strikeout rate. And he hits the ball just about as hard as the average big leaguer, which is sounds like boring, maybe. But being able to put the bat on the ball and actually hit it hard, at least somewhat hard, that's huge. And that's something that I do think, him not being a huge home run hitter and more being like a doubles gap to gap, kind of like the thing you were saying with Nick Castellanos earlier on in the show, was like that double gap to gap production could be absolutely huge if he's at and plus on top of that defensive safety net that he will provide for guys like Sheets and Nick Castellanos, who haven't played a ton of first in their careers to this point. So I think that's really big past the headline of him coming back to play with Stammen, is that it's a really serviceable, I think that's the perfect word to kind of put it when it comes to France and what he's going to bring to the team.
Yeah, it's part of that. It's part of a winning formula is to have guys who are average to above average players coming off of your bench, because we saw what the bench was last year, and the less said about that, the better. It says a lot when your best bench player last year was Bryce Johnson in his 382 BABIP, compared to some of the guys they had, like Martin Maldonado, who somehow hit multiple home runs, which was surprising to me. And you had Trenton Brooks, who outside of one home run was it was like that meme of what's the polar bear doing in Texas. Like that's kind of what that felt like in the moment. But I think a bench with Andujar, Castellanos, Ty France, and then it'll probably end up being Bryce Johnson, who will be like the outfielder, and then whoever the backup catcher is. You feel confident going into the year with a bench of guys who can hit and who can kind of play around all over the field. Especially if we see how Castellanos and Andujar do defensively in spring training, that'll be another thing to watch. But this team has depth, and it doesn't have depth where you're like, who is this guy? It's depth where, you have an idea of what to expect from them. And it really, it's great to have, it's starting to feel like a complete team. Even though there's a ton of question marks in the starting rotation, you have more of a feeling that this puzzle is starting to come together.
Yeah, no, and just going back to having all those, having depth that their names is huge. I remember last season going into the season, not going into spring training, but going into the regular season, there was essentially, you did have Brandon Lockridge available. He was kind of waiting in the mix there, but the kind of feeling was that our left field spot is going to be Jason Hayward, or it's going to be Connor Joe, and that's it. That's what we have. If that doesn't work out, there is no plan B. And I think it was really, really awesome about giving all these guys, just a chance to compete for every spot, is that if you lose the job, if you don't come come out as the starting first baseman or the starting DH, like, cool, you're going to be an above average bench player in the major leagues. Like, it's really nice to like to feel like you sign someone to play a starting role that will naturally be forced to play a bench role. I think that's probably like the best thing that's going to come out of all of this, is that at the worst, like, you're going to have at least two guys on the bench who are proven major league hitters, like, who will, at least be able to provide you with like average hitting, or good like a defensive defensive replacement, and like 240 average, 250 average sort of stuff. I think that's huge, and that's why I love bringing in France specifically, because he allows like some of those other guys to even fill spots, like having Nick Castellanos or Miguel on Duhar come in to pinch hit late late in games. That doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound what you kind of would have expected from a team like this, from the past, in the past few years. This feels different in that sense, and that's why that's probably the thing I'm most excited about, is just seeing what they can do, and how they optimize this group to really make that depth felt, and translated into offense.
Definitely. I think bringing in France, I just thought about it while you were talking about it. Bringing in France reminds me a little bit of when they brought in Brandon Drury a couple of years ago. I'm actually, this hoodie I'm wearing is actually from that game where Drury hit the grand slam in the first inning. The first game with Soto and Bell and Drury, and I forget who else they had at that deadline, but
Hater.
Right,
It was just
Josh Hader. Just Hader.
Mhm.
From that deadline, like, it reminds me of, it feels like that kind of move where you bring in a guy who the last couple seasons have been a little rough, but he showed some potential. Like, he had 277 with the Blue Jays after hitting kind of slowly in Minnesota. So I think that with Ty, I think we're going to get a really good ball player, and we've seen what he can do, for the better or for the worse, because they traded him for Austin Nola and Austin Adams and Dan Altavilla, and we don't need to talk about that trade and how that worked out. But with France as your backup infielder and Sungmun Song, like, you feel really well about where this bench is, and you have guys who can fill in at every position. And that's one of the things that this team is really needed, because every time, come the middle of summer, when you've got guys who are dealing with injuries, like, who are you going to plug into the lineup? Would you rather plug in like a Ty France, or would you rather plug in Mason McCoy?
Oh, if that is a real question, I did not take that as a real question, because
It's meant to be rhetorical.
Oh, sorry.
No.
You gave me a good 5 seconds, but Ty France. Answer A. Ty France.
Yeah, like 100 out of 100 times you would take Ty France, because he's consistently hit at the major league level. He's been a solid middle of the lineup presence. He gets on base. He does all the little things that you like out of a utility infielder. This roster feels like we're so close to having a complete roster. Like, the bullpen, we don't even need to worry about, because if there's one thing the Padres have done very well in their entire history, is they have somehow consistently put up some of the best bullpens in baseball. And that goes for even the years where they're losing 100 games. They still have top 15 relief units in the league. And the fact that we've gone this whole episode with barely even mentioning the bullpen, because it just feels like such a lock, such a complete area of this roster. And that I do want to ask, if the Padres, let's say the rotation experiments pan out a little too well, do you think that, because some of these guys have opt-outs and they might not take them, do you think we might see a trade between now and opening day?
I wouldn't rule it out. That is something we also haven't touched on, that our good friend of trading, anybody for anything at any time is, just got extended. That's awesome. Bringing back AJ Preller, length of the deal not announced, but yeah, with him still there making the phone calls, I would absolutely say yes. It's definitely it's not very common for teams to see like how another team's spring training is going. That's kind of unheard of, I think. Because usually, spring is all about your team. It's all about, this is this is what we have. This is what, like we're going to make the best of the guys at this camp. It would be really, really shocking if they were able to reach a deal with, someone to offload one of those guys, or, like do that. But I don't think it's out of the question just because of how much depth there is, and there just isn't a place to go for some of these guys. And like we said, like these are, I mean at least, like we said with the position players, like these are above average bench players. So there are other teams who might say, hey, like Buehler looks great, or like we didn't see this when we were looking at signing Herman Marquez, and he just showed it in his data that is available from his spring training starts, and like that could be something that could happen. It is possible. It just would be an absolute shock to me if another team is able to pick that up and get that done. But yeah, I mean, I do think it would be beneficial, and the Padres could make something great out of it, especially with how kind of, I mean, the clock starts to tick, for a lack of a better term, for some teams when they don't like what they have, or like going into the season, like it would be a really optimal time to pull something like that. But yeah, I would be shocked if like a team's able to pull that off.
It would be shocking, but you mentioned, AJ Preller just got extended. This is AJ Preller. He's the same guy who made a trade when the Padres were getting on a plane to Korea. He's the same guy who made a trade the night of opening. 'Twas the night before opening day, and AJ Preller goes and gets Taylor Rogers and Brent Rooker for Chris Paddock and someone else. I already forgot that. There's Chris Paddock and somebody else for Taylor Rogers and Brent Rooker. So anything really is possible with AJ, but we'll see kind of what happens with spring training, because it's really going to be, there's so many things to look forward to in this spring training that it's really just a good time to be watching Padres baseball. We've waited this long, from beginning of October until now. We've waited about 4.5 months, and they're playing their first spring training game the day that this episode drops. This episode is dropping again on a Friday. So if you are listening to this episode before spring training starts, listen to the episode, then enjoy the game. Or you can listen to this episode while you watch the game. It's really up to you as to how you choose to consume this content. We're not going to tell you how to do it. That's up to you. But we definitely, we're looking forward to spring training getting up and going, and it's just such a fun time to be a baseball fan right now. College baseball is up and going. I don't know if you've watched any college baseball, but goodness, like I'd not watched much of it until now, and having seen a couple of games, it's quite a show, really. Like without the exposure, and then now seeing even just the highlights from games, just it's pretty electric to watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I too have been very, very out of college for a while, but it is just such a huge vast scope of teams and divisions and prospects. Like obviously the draft is massive, and there's so many guys who are fighting for a chance there, and fun. It's a really fun time to be a fan. I personally, I love that the site that I am on every single day, Baseball Savant. They have that nice little thing up there that says how many days that there are until spring training games, the World Baseball Classic, which is 2 weeks away. But by the way, that is I believe in 15 days. And then obviously opening day, which is coming up in March. So absolutely awesome time. I personally cannot wait. I don't know how much stats notes I'm going to be taking on Friday at 12. I will probably be tuned into the game. But yeah, I believe they're giving the start to Logan Gillespie.
Yeah,
he's going to get the start. Awesome. Don't really care who it is, to be honest. I'm just excited, just excited to see anybody on the hill wearing brown and gold. So I cannot wait for Friday.
definitely. I know that with the early spring training games, we're going to see a lot of the non-roster guys, a lot of the minor leaguers get some time on the mound as spring training really kicks off. And this spring training is really interesting. One of the fun things is a lot of the guys who are in the WBC are going to be heading off to go and pitch in the WBC or play in the WBC. A lot of the bigger names for the Padres include Manny Machado, Fernando Tatis Jr., Xander Bogaerts, even some guys like Ron Marinaccio and Alec Jacob for Team Italy, Carter Lowen, one of their prospects for Team Canada, among quite a few other names. So do you think this is going to be a great opportunity for some guys to take advantage and really make a name for themselves this spring?
Yeah, it's going to be really, really, fun to see where the Padres go with their lineups and their rotation of guys when Mason Miller and Fernando most of the starters go out, and they have a couple pitchers as well. Yuki Matsui's also going. He's another bullpen regular, if you will, I guess. And so I mean, I do think it's going to be an awesome chance for those guys to get some more innings. It's usually one inning, maybe two for some guys who are more startery type of guys. And so I do think it's going to be fun to see. Maybe we'll see a little longer outings from some of the guys who are under the proverbial microscope. And so that'll be super, super exciting. And again, it'll be I think the most fun to see Padres players playing against each other, repping their home countries, and that's I cannot wait. I know we saw maybe a preview of it in spring training on the backfields, but I would love to see Mason Miller face Padres' two best hitters, Manny Machado and Fernando Tatis. That is the one thing I have on my wish list going into this preseason,
tournament.
Pre-tournament. That's the number one thing I have on my World Baseball Classic wish list.
Yeah, that right there. This WBC is shaping up to be absolute cinema, and I think we're going to be in for a really great time. The WC is going to be feeding families like crazy in terms of baseball content and just the experience. And then, we've still got spring training going on. I think, with a lot of the guys who are going off, like German Marquez, I believe, is pitching for Team Venezuela, if I'm not mistaken. I think he's another one of the guys who's heading off to the WBC. There's a lot of opportunity for guys like, we mentioned Buehler, and we mentioned, maybe even Griffin Canning. Definitely a guy like Jagger Haynes is going to get some starts. Check that off the list. There's our obligatory Haynes mention. I think that's 5. I think
maybe
it's 5.
5.
Maybe 6.
Okay.
No idea. 5. However many episodes this show's been going on, but every time it just, we can't forget. But it'll definitely be interesting to see him, maybe even Miguel Mendez throw in 2 innings at a time. I know next week we'll definitely be talking some prospects, but this spring training that's coming up is going to be pretty exciting. Um, the one thing I want to get your take on is, I know we can save this for a future episode, but you know what would be a real interesting thought experiment sort of thing to do live on the show? If we projected do you remember the spring breakout games that happen
Yes,
every year, the
I
prospect games?
actually went to the Padres one last year. I sat in the
Oh,
front row. It was awesome.
yeah, that
Yeah.
was a great game. I remember watching that. Seeing guys like Braden Carpathios, guys like I know Isaiah Lowe pitched in that game. Braden Nett started the game, if I'm not
Mhm.
mistaken. Like, there's a lot of guys who are getting their first real like national exposure to a lot of evaluators who are not as familiar. I think trying to project what that roster is going to look like would be real interesting to do on the show. I think
No, yeah, that
creating
yeah. No, that would be awesome. I mean, there's so many, like it's really kind of, fun to make, lists and stuff and, rank like all off of the future value and all that. But seeing the prospects out on the diamond, like lined up position by position, like that was so, so cool to see. And, obviously you have your, at least in terms of, you know, position players. You're probably gonna have Ethan Salas, behind, sitting behind the plate, kind of capping that off, which is super. I mean, that's it. It was just a really fun experience, and I'm glad they're bringing it back. That would I mean, that's definitely a great idea. Something we should bring into possibly next week's show, or closer to the actual game itself. But yeah, no, I'd be really interested to like dive in and see what that team looks like, and definitely see it could be an opportunity for a lot of guys. It's definitely more, just objectively thin with how many guys like were traded, and like it'll be a very very fresh looking group, and that would be that would be a really really cool idea.
that'll be really interesting. I think they are facing the Cubs prospects this year, so that's going to be really interesting as well. Just the Cubs have a middle of the pack farm system. The Padres have what's called a bottom end farm system because of all the trades that they make. But we have, like we talked with Sam a couple of weeks ago on our show. Somehow they just keep having more prospects. They just keep like almost spawning them, really. And it's gonna be fascinating to just see how some of these guys play in spring training and even leading into that. So, to those of you who tune in to hear us talk about prospects, there wasn't as much this time, but just you wait. Don't worry, that talk hasn't gone away. It's still very much in our minds. So, um, is there any other topics you want to touch on? Because I know there's been a lot of movement in spring training. So,
Yeah, the only other thing I think I had was that the end of tier so time. I know that was a popular phrase online. Is yeah, I know I think we talked about him maybe a month ago or so. Like it was a while ago, but
yeah,
I remember. Yeah, it does kind of sting to see him go. Like he's someone who like was a kind of fan favorite type of guy. And I mean, did he have the skill set to become like everyday player, or like a platoon hitter? That's debatable. That we'd love more data on him to see just how realistic that would be. But it's definitely going to be a different feel. It's not going to be it's not going to be the same on the Padres top prospects list without him somewhere in the
yeah.
middle. Somewhere in the middle. He's always somewhere in the middle. So
Yeah, it's really strange. 'Cause here's a fun thing. I was thinking about this last night when when I saw the DFA news, he was the second to last member of the 2016 international signing class to be in the organization. There's only one left, and that's Adrian Morejon. That's both alarming, depressing, and also says a lot about, player development, because you sign these guys when they're really young, and, there's all the projectability in the world, but how much are they truly going to develop? And, for a lot of these guys, after the COVID year, that was kind of it for them because the minor leagues got cut down and there were less roster spots, much more battling that had to be done. And, with Tirso, it's interesting because he always struck me as a platoon bat in the long term. Like I always thought he's going to be a guy who's going to get hit like 450-foot nukes against right-handed pitchers. And, you don't play him against lefties because major league quality left-handed breaking balls are going to absolutely pick apart that swing. I just hope he gets, an opportunity. Doesn't matter if it's with San Diego or somebody else. He's kind of a local guy. I believe he was born in Tijuana, not far from San Diego. So, you wish him the best because, Padres fans and evaluators have seen him come up in the system and seen what he's been able to do. It's just a question of, is he going to find playing time? I think that's really a big thing because he does have that pedigree, and we've seen teams gamble on former top prospects all the time. So I wouldn't be surprised if a team that is rebuilding looks to pick him up on waivers, someone like a Washington or even I would say maybe Washington, because you know how they love to have Padre prospects on their team because they kind of seem to be the only part of their team that develops. I know Nats fans are not expecting that stray, but I'm not. It's just, I could go on about that, but I'm just not going to do that. Right? I'm not. This is not the time or the place. I'll leave it at that. But,
yeah, we can let them be excited about Dalen Lyle and Cade Cavalli and leave it at that.
Yeah. But with Tirso, wishing him well, hopefully he finds playing time. And if he ends up, staying in the organization, rebuild that stock and, prove to the organization that, you're still someone they want to count on because he's shown the upside he has. So at the end of the day, it's just a question of really rebuilding that confidence. And I think he can definitely do it. So is it going to be sad not writing him on a top 30 list? I will admit it was a little sad not typing his name and, discussions about, how he did last year and, what he can do in the future. But, Padres fans will always remember him for better or worse. And he made his debut at the major league level last year. So, he experienced something that is a lot of people's dream. So at the end of the day, you're happy that he made the big leagues. Hopefully he can find his way back.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, awesome. I'm happy to say I watched his first and I think last hit, I believe.
Oh,
first and last hit, beautiful liner to center field on a Friday night at home. So,
yeah,
I mean,
his first hit.
Yeah.
And last hit so far.
Last hit. But yeah, no, it's definitely, tough to watch him go. He kind of feels like he's, a member of the team when he really only spent a couple of weeks, maybe just a week with the team. But, yeah, I mean, he could have, we've seen times when players go down and they rebuild their, stock like we've seen. It's not out of the question. He is big. He's strong. He has a solid mechanical, like his swing is mechanically sound. I think, I do think he's got potential in that, sense to get better at hitting breaking balls and adjust the velocity a little bit if he can shorten it down a little bit. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I mean, there's, it's not the end of the road for him by any means, but definitely going to be a little bit different not having him in the mix.
For sure, but that's the game. That's how the game goes. And if he's still in the organization, cool. If he finds a place that gives him playing time, good for him. That's how the game. That's just the reality of the game, and it's what makes baseball so fascinating. At the end of the day, so I mean that's really all I got on that. So I
Me as well.
think folks, that's going to be a wrap for this episode. Thank you all once again for tuning in. We are doing our best to get this out consistently. We hope you've been enjoying the content. Our personal pages are linked in the description below, along with Willy's latest work for, a really fun organization. Big news on your end. Don't know if you wanted to announce that, but
Yeah,
you
no,
wanted to.
I just recently began writing for baseballer BSBLERs. It might be more commonly seen on online, but yeah, no, I'm really glad and thankful for that chance to write for them, and bring some more bring some more scope of more like more teams into it, and like keep my Padres connection here, and kind of get to cover the bigger scope of the major league baseball. So that's I'm excited for that. But yeah,
Congratulations once again.
thank you.
Our co-host here, our co-host is going places, folks. So keep an eye out on him too. So thank you all once again to everyone for tuning in to the latest episode of In Focus, a production of the Padres EVT Podcast and EastVillageTimes.com. Click the links in the description to go to EastVillageTimes.com for more coverage, as well as our personal pages where we post our own work or Willy's work with the baseballer. Thank you all once again. Breathe. And on behalf of co-host Willy Warren, this is Diego Garcia signing off. Thank you all very much for tuning in. We'll talk to you all again very soon.